Jeff, would you come and read our first lesson?
Our first lesson is from the Gospel of Luke, first chapter, starting verse 26. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. He came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end." Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy. He will be called Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren. For nothing will be impossible with God." Then Mary said, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." Then the angel departed from her.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, last week, let me say this. What a surprise it was for Laura and I last week to have that great gift of celebrating with the congregation our 5 years of being here. So thank you. I know that it was a really meaningful thing for us, and I know that didn't come together without a lot of coordination and planning and cooperation among folks, which makes it all the sweeter. So thank you. That was great. And Joe, as he preached, he introduced this topic of disciples. We're going to look at discipleship, but through the lens of particular ones, and we're using that term disciple widely, not just the 12. New Testament talks about large circles, hundreds of folks who carried that title, Jesus, who some stayed with him through and kept growing, others fell away partway through. We're extending it to even people that appear in just quick encounters with Jesus, or as this morning's character, Mary, who knew him the longest of any earthly person. Mary's was a hinge faith. She wasn't a Christian, she was Jewish. She had an Old Testament faith, and by the end, she was part of the new followers of Jesus. So we're going to start kind of maybe partly what would have been familiar to her with an Old Testament faith. And so the second reading comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 30. You can find that towards the beginning of the Old Testament. The 5th book there. I'm going to read out of order a little bit. I'm going to read verses 15 and 16 and then jump up to 14 through 11. So chapter 30, starting with verse 15 and then up to 11. "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God and to walk in obedience to him and to keep his commandments." Now verse 11, "What I'm commanding you is not too difficult for you. It's not beyond your reach. It's not up in heaven that you have to ask, who can ascend to heaven and get it and proclaim it to us so that we can obey? It's not beyond the sea that you have to ask, well, who will cross the sea and get it and proclaim it to us so that we can obey? No. The word is very near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart so that you may obey it." Let me make a couple observations about that passage before we consider Mary. I'm going to set the stage a little bit. And first is this. we can say no to God. That's part of what it means to be human, given this gift of freedom. We can say no to God. In fact, Deuteronomy, we have this book, Deuteronomy means the second law, and the ancient Hebrews were given the law a second time because the first time they'd received it, they were given an opportunity to enter in and take possession of the land, and they were frightened. And they said no. You might remember the 12 spies go out, and 10 of them come back, and they say, we feel like grasshoppers in the eyes of these giants. The land is beautiful, but we can't do this. It's not within us to take this land. Only Joshua and Caleb wanted to give it a try, so they didn't go. And that's why, you might remember, that's why the ancient Hebrews wandered for 40 years. They weren't lost. They were waiting for the generation that didn't have the courage to go to die off. They weren't destroyed. They lived another 40 years or some portion of that 40 years. They did eat manna the whole time. They didn't get to walk into the promised land. But they said no, and so they didn't participate. And that generation of folks who said no, they were the ones who had exited Egypt. They were the ones who saw the 10 plagues. They were the ones who walked through the Red Sea. They had been led by a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire by night. They had seen quail drop from the heavens when God provided them meat, and every morning there was manna that appeared like dew. Their sandals didn't wear out. They saw God provide for them. They drank water from a rock. They'd received the 10 Commandments that was given. What is it that God requires? Here it is, the way to walk in. And yet, when it was time for the next chapter, the next big thing, to move into the promised land, they said, no, we don't want to go with you there. And we can say no to God, but we don't thwart God's purposes. You know, Amanda asked that question, what if Mary had said no? And I was thinking about that myself, actually. And my mind went to the book of Esther. You might remember that beautiful story in the Old Testament. Esther finds herself as one of the princesses in the king's harem, and she's Jewish, and there's a plot against her people. And her uncle Mordecai, he uses this phrase that has become popular, probably even books with this title. He says, "Who knows but that you have risen to this position in the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows that you're right where you need to be for a moment just like this?" But in the very same verse, he says something that isn't as popular. We don't write books about this. He says, "And if you don't, well, God will rise up help for the Israelites some other way. But you and your family, you'll be destroyed." And not vindictively, just that's what will happen. Like if you don't act to save our people, the ones who are tied to the court, you and your others, you're surely going to die by this edict. You're a sitting duck. But you won't thwart God's purposes. This will go for it. Salvation will come in a different direction. We can say no to be a part of what God's up to. It doesn't mean that God stops being up to what he's up to. It just means we don't get to be part of it. Choose to opt out of it. We can say no, and it really only hurts us. It can also hurt others around us. Miss out on good things, our family members, our neighbors. But God's commitment to work redemptively for his people, that keeps moving forward. And the second thing about this passage in Deuteronomy that informs our reading of Mary is that it's no great mystery what God calls us to. I like the way I put it. It's not in some far place, up in the heavens, that we have to wonder, can someone fly up there and get this word from God and bring it to us? It's not on the other side of the sea that someone has to go on a dangerous voyage to collect it and come back and tell us what it is. No, it's right here. It says it's near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart. You can obey it. The New Testament puts even a sharper edge on this. You know, it boils it all down to what is the whole heart of the law? It's just this: love God with your whole heart and your neighbor like yourself. There it is. It's not a mystery you need to keep looking for. You don't need to put your name on the waiting list to get the secret from the library. It's there. It's available for you. It's quite simple. Simple is not the same as easy, but it is simple. Well, here we have Mary. She comes as a young woman. Mary is an interesting character. And if any of you have Catholic backgrounds, you might know that Mary can focus quite centrally in worship. There's a rich tradition of admiring, adoring Mary, even seeking her intercession on our behalf. There's a lot of pictures. In fact, in Western art, Mary is probably the one next to Jesus most popular and recurrent subjects for painting. Mary's everywhere. Sadly, some of our brothers and sisters in the Catholic tradition make Mary almost superhuman, unlike us in all ways. Never sinned, perpetual virgin, so unlike us that she can intervene on our behalf. I think that there's a danger of making her too unlike the rest of us, so we don't learn what she has to offer. In Protestant circles, Mary almost never gets any attention except when we ask some 6-year-old girl to put on a bathrobe and play her on Christmas Eve. And that's the only attention she gets. And other than that, we don't pay too much attention to Mary. And so, too, we can fail to learn from her what she has to teach us. So 2 things we can note about that passage that Jeff read for us. And the angel Gabriel's annunciation to her and then her response back. And the first is this. Both of them are in Mary's actual response, the words that she says. And the first thing that she says is, how can this be? How can this be? She knows. There are some folks who dismiss New Testament as being about primitive people who don't understand the way the world works. You think that young women can have babies without the normal acts of procreation. Well, no, they understood. Mary understood. She knew, how can this be? There's a way that she's saying, quite literally, I don't have it in me to bear a child. The necessary conditions aren't met. It's not in me to do this thing. So how's that going to happen? How can that happen? It's interesting that Gabriel says, he will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord your God will give him the throne of David. He will reign over Jacob. She's saying, hey, you're going to be the mother of the king, whose kingdom knows no end. She doesn't get distracted by that piece. She wants to know the basics. How can we even get started here? I don't have it in me to do this. That's a pretty common response in Scripture. We see it over and over. God, I don't have it in me. That was Abram's response. I'm going to make you the father of nations. How can that be? I don't have it in me. I haven't yet had one child. It was Moses' response. He encounters God at the burning bush, and God says, I want you to go back and lead my people out. Who am I? I'm nobody. And, well, I'm not just a nobody. I'm wanted for murder back there. But I don't. They won't listen to me. I have no authority. I can't speak with any power. And about 4 times, he tells God, I'm not the guy. I'm not even eloquent. I don't speak good. And then finally God gets frustrated. He exasperates God with his objections. God, it's not in me. And God said, it doesn't matter. I know what's in you and what's not in you. It doesn't matter. Gideon, I'm not a warrior. How can I lead your people? Even Peter, the Apostle Peter's initial response when he was in the boat fishing with Jesus, he says, Lord, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. I'm not the kind of guy you want to hang out with. And in each of these cases, God says, I know what's there and I know what's not there. And it's not you to do. I'm doing it. You just need to say yes. Need to be willing to go along. You know, the heart of the good news, the gospel, it's not, as N.T. Wright says, good advice. It's not a program to put in play in your life. It's news that's announced that all you have to do is say yes. It's about what God is doing, not what we have to do. It's not advice about how to live. It's an enunciation of what God is doing in the world and an invitation to join in with that. God always acts beyond our own native ability to accomplish within us what he wants to do. It's things that we can't do on our own. That's some of the joy and the risk of following Jesus, is he will do things that we wouldn't choose on our own and couldn't do on our own. He says, I'm doing it. You want to come along? And we object. Well, no, God, I could never forgive that person. It's not in me to forgive that person. Oh, God, I'll never be a joyful person. That's not in me. I'll never become patient. It's not part of who I am. I could never witness to those ones or share good news with those people. That's not who I am. It's not in me. We say those same type of objections. Mary's, I don't think, was an objection. It was an honest question. How can it be? And the reply she gets back, Gabriel tells her right at the end, nothing is impossible with God. His answer is in reference to who God is, not who Mary is. And the life we're invited into is in reference to who God is and what God's doing, not what we have and what we don't have. It's always in the larger picture. It was Mary's first response. Discipleship, we might say, is simply a willingness to respond to the news of what God is doing and go places that on our own it's impossible to go. To be what on our own is impossible to be. The second thing that Mary says, her only words of response are, let it be done to me according to your word. She says, yes. I'm the servant of the Lord. I'm at your disposal, God. Let it be done. Now, she could have said no. Some people, some commentators don't like that she uses the word slave. Doulos, it's a Greek word. It means slave, common household slave. Yeah, it's demeaning to Mary. Well, no, she chose it for herself. And she chose it because she knew she could have said no. She says, okay, I'll accept this position because I trust you. I'll be a part of this thing that you're up to. You know, when she said that yes, she knew that there was some cost involved. We don't know a lot about Mary, but we can piece some things together about her life. We know she was pretty poor, and we know that by the decisions she and Joseph made, the resources they had, the way they made sacrifices. The text gives us little clues that things that signal they were in a pretty low class. We know this too, that she is from the town of Nazareth, where Joseph grew up. Now, that town used to have a great reputation. It was the home of the Nazarites, the Nazarenes, those ones who had a kind of a special calling. They never drank fermented drink. They never touched a dead anything, and they didn't cut their hair, and they were devoted to the service of God. And so at one point, Nazareth was a home center of these guys. But over the years, they kind of lost that tradition, or they perverted it, or misused it, and actually it became a place of ill repute. Do you remember what Nathaniel said when he's being told about who Jesus is? They say, hey, we found a Messiah. Who is it? It's Jesus from Nazareth. Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's a bad reputation. There are not a lot of righteous folks in the town at this point. But Mary, she had found somebody. Someone skilled. Joseph was a carpenter. He was skilled and he was righteous. Matthew tells us, a righteous man. She found an opportunity in life. a way forward with promise in it. This guy wanted her as a spouse, chose her. And she knew that saying yes to this plan would jeopardize that. In the most severe case, if Joseph had decided and taken offense, he might have said, listen, you've been unfaithful to me, and so I'm going to tell the community that you're an adulterer. And that typically would mean this, that they would allow her to carry the baby to term, and then if they chose to, they could stone her. When she said yes to this thing, part of the gamble was a possibility that her neighbors would turn on her and stone her after the baby was born. Alternatively, and this is the plan that Matthew says, the Gospel of Matthew says Joseph decided to take, he was going to put her away quietly. That was divorce her quietly without spreading the news around, not explaining why. It was just going to be a divorce. But that would mean then Mary and her newborn infant did not have a family association. She could not marry again. And in those days, marriages were an economic, there's real economic, well, they are in these days. Marriage is an economic thing, you know. I couldn't do it on my own. You know, so she knew that there was cost. What she didn't know that Jesus' birth was going to stir up Jerusalem so much that Herod would send death squads out to kill male infants. She didn't know that the birth of this baby was going to mean that she and her new husband were going to have to flee their country and become refugees in a foreign land. She didn't know that Jesus was going to be such a thorn in the side of both the religious leaders and the Roman authorities that he would often have to hide and sneak about surreptitiously. You know, she had no idea that at the end of his life, he would be branded a threat to the state and an apostate to the faith and suffer a cruel and ignoble death as a common criminal. She didn't know that. It wasn't until 8 days after he was born that the prophet Simeon there at the temple, when she takes Jesus to be circumcised, and he looks at the child and, you know, he says, this one is going to lead to the rise and fall in many of Israel, and a sword will pierce your soul too. What does that mean for a young mother, maybe still in her teens, just gave birth to this little marvelous bundle that, like every mother, she's in love with, and somebody whom she doesn't know, an important man in the temple, and she's a small town girl, lifts up the child and says, a sword will pierce your soul. And maybe she wonders, what have I gotten into? What's going forward? But she keeps saying yes to what God is doing. You know, I once remember I was probably 20 years old, and a guy I was studying philosophy with, who was also a Christian and a poet, and I asked him, is Christianity something you do or something that happens to you? You know? And there's certainly an aspect of Christian faith that is being done unto, enduring. And Mary, those are her words, may it be done unto me according to your word. It's not passive, but it's receptive. Saying yes to this thing that God is up to. You know, I like to know what's going to go on ahead of time. I like to plan. I like to be strategic. Well, I'm not very strategic in a real leadership way. I can be when I'm just thinking about how to spend the weekend and what job needs to be done and how to tackle a problem. And if I can possibly avoid 3 trips to the hardware store, try that, you know. This came to play about 34 years ago. Laura and I were entertaining the possibility of getting married. And me, thinking strategically and practically, wondered out loud, is that a right move? Can we afford that? What would it mean about our work situations and our summer plans for who's living where and working? I don't know, maybe it's not right. And I remember Laura saying to me, this is the way I think about it. If it's the right thing to do, we say yes, and then we figure it out. Then we work it out. We commit to this direction, and then we work it out. Like Tina Fey said, say yes, and you'll figure it out. It's a good rule for stand-up comedy, and improv. Say yes, and figure it out as you go. Following Jesus is kind of like improv comedy. Say yes. See what he's up to. See what it's about. Because this whole theme of discipleship, of walking with Jesus, it's not about having things figured out. It's not about assenting to a doctrine. It's not having a coherent theology. It's about saying, yes, I will take the next step in following this guy who calls me to come. Just like Mary. She didn't know all that it meant. She had no idea what this meant. She said, okay, I'll go along with this. I'll follow him. I'll do this thing. I wonder, what is it that keeps you from saying yes fully? And Martin Luther King, he said this once, thinking about him this weekend. Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. That's a good word for me, because one of my little hang-ups is wanting to know, wanting to figure out, wanting to understand and see things. And sometimes I think I would be happy not to engage the world, but just understand it. That's not what's on offer when Jesus says, come and follow me. He says, take the next step. Some of us are afraid of missing out. What if I commit to this direction? What about other possibilities in life I might lose if I say yes to this? Some of us are afraid of being wrong. We want certainty that it's the absolute right thing before we go. Some of us are afraid of being involved in stuff that's messy and uncertain. Some of us might rightfully be afraid of losing relationships with others if we go a certain direction. Some of us are afraid of losing control. We like control. And Jesus is not one who gives us a ton when he's doing what he's doing. Some of us are afraid of being disrespected. Some of us are afraid we won't be able to express ourselves the way we want to and contribute in the ways that we think are most meaningful. But being a disciple, encountering Jesus and following him like Mary showed us, is in the first instance a receptive act. The news is God is doing something. God's in the business of redeeming this world. God's in the business of reconciling broken relationships. God's in the business of forgiving us all and giving us new hope. God's in the business of stirring up in us things that might feel foreign, like joy and peace and love and hope and perseverance and long-suffering. That's what God's doing. All you have to say is yes to the news, like Mary, and respond forward. So I'm going to give you 3 questions to take into your week. And I want you to think about a concrete situation, a real situation. One that may be taking your attention in a negative way, creating anxiety and worry. Maybe one that is attracting your attention in a more curious way, wondering what's going on. And about that situation, I want you to ask this. What might God be up to in this? We're assured that God is already here, already working in every situation. What maybe is God up to in this situation? What could God be up to? Secondly, is there anything that is keeping me back? Anything that's holding me back? Any objections that are coming to mind? I don't have it in me, God, to be a part of that. Or whatever that objection, what might be keeping you from full engagement? And then the third thing is, what is the next step of saying yes? It's just the next step. Say yes. So find a concrete and a real situation ask, what might God be up to here already? Secondly, what's getting in my way? And thirdly, what is a positive step that says yes? And we move forward in that. This final hymn we're going to sing, Jesus calls us over the tumult. I love that. It says we're in the sea, in the life's wild and restless sea is where we find ourselves. And it's there that Jesus' voice calls to us. Day by day, his voice still calls us, saying simply this, Christian, follow me. So as we sing that, let it be our prayer that we would respond.